Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we're really diving deep into a tragedy that I think shocked the world. The 1983 Beirut Barracks bombing.
Yeah.
We're going through excerpts from Tergeted, Beirut, the 1983 Marine Barracks bombing, and the untold origin story of the War on Terror by Jack Carr and James M. Scott.
Great book.
It's really interesting stuff, so I think this will be a really fascinating deep dive.
Yeah, it's, I think when we think about Beirut today, we think about a city ravaged by conflict and war. And what's fascinating is this book starts by taking us back to the years before the Civil War.
Okay.
When Beirut was actually nicknamed the Paris of the Middle East.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, cosmopolitan atmosphere, a real melting pot of cultures. And the book actually mentions designer boutiques right next to theaters premiering the latest Bill Murray flick.
Oh, I mean, that's such a stark contrast to what we think of when we think about Beirut today.
Absolutely. And I think that's what makes this deep dive so compelling is that we're going to really trace how this vibrant city transformed into a city scarred by violence.
And that kind of leads us to, where our deep dive begins. By 1983, Beirut was really caught in this brutal civil war.
Right.
And the U.S. Marines arrived as peacekeepers. They're bringing with them this glimmer of hope for stability.
And it's important to remember that their presence was meant to be a stabilizing force. They weren't there to engage in the fighting.
Right.
They were there as a symbol of peace, to help protect Lebanon's independence.
So more of a peacekeeping mission.
Exactly. The book actually uses that term, a mission of presence, and that really shaped how the Marines operated.
So they weren't expecting to be attacked or anything.
No, not at all. They were focused on building relationships with the local population.
Wow.
They even set up a band to play concerts for the community. Can you imagine a Marine band playing their hearts out in war-torn Beirut?
That's kind of incredible and heartbreaking at the same time, knowing what's coming.
It really sets the stage for the tragedy that unfolded.
So it was October 23rd, 1983, a seemingly ordinary Sunday for the Marine station there.
Right.
Some of them were prepping for a visit from General Kelly, even had a cook making lobster.
Lobster of all things.
Right. Others were setting up for that Marine band concert you were talking about, just trying to bring a little bit of normalcy, I guess.
Yeah, this sliver of hope in a city that was really on edge.
The calm before the storm, as they say.
Tragically, yes, it was a little after 6 a.m. when a yellow Mercedes truck packed with thousands of pounds of explosives approached the Marine compound.
Oh, my God.
The book describes how the truck bypassed security checkpoints, crashed through barriers, and ultimately detonated directly beneath the building housing the battalion landing team's headquarters.
Wait, the battalion landing team, can you explain what that is for those of us who are not military strategists?
Sure. So think of the battalion landing team, or BLT, as like the tip of the spear. A highly mobile, self-sufficient unit trained to deploy very rapidly.
Okay.
They were the first line of defense in a crisis, and that made their headquarters a prime target.
And the book actually compares this blast to the U.S. Embassy bombing earlier that year.
It does, and it says that this explosion was 6 to 9 times stronger. Witnesses described it as unlike anything they'd ever experienced, just a scene of instant and unimaginable devastation.
That's horrifying.
That 4-story building where so many Marines were sleeping just obliterated, reduced to rubble in a matter of seconds.
I mean, you said obliterated, so we're talking just a mountain of rubble and debris. I can't even imagine the sheer scale of the destruction.
Yeah, the book really drives that point home. It talks about how rescuers were just met with this, this horrifying scene of twisted metal and concrete and bodies.
Oh, God.
And amidst that chaos, you have these Marines, Navy corpsmen, even Seabees, who are basically the Navy's construction engineers.
Oh, okay.
Risking their own lives to try to pull their comrades from the wreckage.
It must have been absolutely horrific. Just, talk about a worst case scenario.
The book does a really good job, I think, of capturing that sense of chaos and courage. These guys are pulling their friends, their brothers in arms from the wreckage, knowing every second counts, and they were dealing with just horrific injuries.
And the book mentions that the medical response was actually led by 2 Navy dentists.
Yeah, isn't that wild? Because the battalion surgeon, a Dr. John Hudson, he was missing.
Oh, no.
And the book actually talks about Dr. Hudson a bit.
Yeah.
He was a talented surgeon, but also a musician. Loved Dixieland jazz, had a wife and a baby son back home. And he'd even written to his wife about his fears of dying in Beirut.
Oh my gosh, to be living with that fear every day and then to...
It's just heartbreaking, and I think it really underscores the human cost of this tragedy. And it wasn't just those who were there. Imagine being a family member back home, clinging to hope, trying to piece together information from these fragmented news reports.
Oh, the not knowing must have been just agonizing.
Absolutely. The book talks about the incomplete casualty lists, the rumors that were swirling around, families were left in limbo, bracing themselves for the worst, while clinging to these slimmest threads of hope. It's a stark reminder of war's ripple effect, how this tragedy touched countless lives far beyond Beirut.
Yeah, and it's not just a tragedy for the Marines. The book tells the story of Micheline Abighanim, a Lebanese woman who actually fell in love with and married a Navy corpsman.
Yes, and tragically he was killed in the bombing. Her story just adds another layer of heartbreak to this event. It reminds us that war doesn't discriminate.
Yeah.
It impacts everyone caught in its crosshairs.
It's a really powerful reminder. So in the aftermath of the bombing, what happened? I imagine there were investigations.
Oh, absolutely. Congress launched an inquiry.
Mm-hmm.
The Pentagon had its own investigation led by Admiral Robert Long.
Okay.
They were trying to understand what led to this tragedy, if it could have been prevented.
And what did they find?
Well, they uncovered this complex web of factors. There were criticisms of the security measures, questions about whether the Marines were truly prepared for an attack of this scale. Some argued that the mission of presence, that emphasis on being a symbol of peace, may have actually made them an easier target.
So it sounds like there were some serious security lapses that allowed this to happen.
There were definitely vulnerabilities, and the book delves into those. But it also points out that despite the escalating violence in Beirut, the shelling, the sniper fire, even the kidnapping of Marines, there was no specific intelligence warning about a truck bomb of this magnitude. This wasn't just another attack. It was something new, something different.
Different? How?
Well, the Long Commission, which was also set up to investigate the bombing, they concluded that this was a new dimension of warfare.
Wow.
That this is a carefully planned, systematic form of terrorism, striking at the very heart of America's presence in the region. And they said that it foreshadowed a new era of terrorism. And reading that really sent chills down my spine.
It is eerie how this event in many ways foreshadowed 9/11.
The parallels are really striking. The scale of the attack, the use of a suicide bomber, the targeting of American symbols, the Beirut Barracks bombing wasn't just a tragedy, it was a terrifying precedent.
So what was the response? Did the U.S. retaliate?
Well, the book details a complex and ultimately inconclusive response. While there was a powerful desire for retribution, the intelligence was murky. It was difficult to pinpoint the exact group or individuals responsible for planning and executing the attack.
But Iran was suspected, right? Because they were known to support Hezbollah.
That's right. And the book does explore those suspicions. There was circumstantial evidence pointing to Iran, but proving their direct involvement was incredibly challenging. This was 1983, long before widespread surveillance and the advanced forensic capabilities we have today.
So if it was so hard to really, pin down who was responsible, what happened to the Marines in Beirut? Did they stay?
Well, the bombing, coupled with, the escalating violence, the political instability in Lebanon, it made it really difficult to justify keeping the Marines there.
Yeah.
And the book really describes this growing sense of disillusionment, both among the Marines on the ground and within the Reagan administration.
Yeah, reading about it, you almost get the feeling that, everyone knew that it was only a matter of time before something like this happened.
There's definitely a sense of foreshadowing throughout the book. The bombing really exposed the vulnerabilities of trying to maintain a peacekeeping presence in a region that was so deeply divided.
Right.
It was a stark reminder of the limits of military intervention, especially in a place like Lebanon, where you have outside forces like Syria and Iran who held so much sway.
Yeah, it just sounds like a really impossible situation, and tragically it wasn't just the Marines who paid the price.
Absolutely. You're right. It's important to remember the Lebanese people who were caught in the crossfire, people like Micheline Abighanim, who lost her husband that day. This event left scars on individuals, on families, on the city of Beirut itself.
And what about President Reagan? The book mentions that he was really deeply affected by the bombing.
The authors actually describe how, he carried the burden of that day, those 241 lives lost for the rest of his life.
I can't even imagine.
They talk about how he wrote letters to families of the victims he met with them, personally. He even visited Camp Lejeune, where many of the Marines were based, and those visits were filled with grief, with this palpable sense of loss.
It's hard to fathom the weight of that grief, the magnitude of that loss.
It's a stark reminder of the human cost of these events. We often talk about the political fallout, the military strategies, but at the heart of it all are the individual stories, the lives that were forever changed.
So where does this leave us? What's the lasting legacy of the Beirut barracks bombing?
It's a question that I think continues to resonate even decades later. The book argues that this event, as horrific as it was, forced a reckoning. It shattered the illusion that terrorism was something that happened over there, something that wouldn't touch American shores.
It was a wake-up call.
Exactly. It exposed the evolving nature of warfare, the terrifying reach of extremism, and the challenges of trying to navigate peace in a region as volatile as the Middle East. And I think it forced a conversation about the role of the United States on the global stage, a conversation that, frankly, we're still grappling with today.
It's a sobering thought. This deep dive has been incredibly insightful, but also emotionally heavy, I have to say.
It is heavy, but it's essential. It's a reminder to never forget the sacrifices that were made, to learn from the mistakes of the past, and to continue to seek understanding in an increasingly complex world.
Yeah, and as we reflect on this tragedy, I think it's also important to remember the victims, not just as numbers, but as individuals with families, with dreams, with lives that were tragically cut short.
You're absolutely right. Their stories deserve to be heard. Their lives honored, their memories kept alive.
Well, this deep dive has been a really powerful journey, I think, through a pivotal moment in history. I want to thank you so much for guiding us through these complex events and for sharing your insights.
It's been my pleasure.
And to our listeners, thank you for joining us on the deep dive. We encourage you to continue exploring this event, seek out the stories of those who were impacted, and reflect on the lessons learned